Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the online debate on low carbon innovation and investment in the EU ETS. This is the second online debate in the LifeSide project, our project on supporting the European policymakers on the implementation and design of the new EU ETS legislation. The project started in September 2016 and it will end by the end of the year. Today we will talk about the ETS and low carbon innovation investment, a very hot topic that plays a crucial role to understand the functioning and the effects of the ETS. And for this purpose, we are supposed to have two guest speakers that I thank you in advance for their participation and availability. I say that supposed to have because unfortunately at the moment we are experiencing some technical problems with one of them, Gregory Nemet. I do hope that we will manage to have him on board. Our team behind the scenes is trying to get the problem solved, and I'm confident that we will manage. But in the meantime, let me introduce Karsten Neuhoff, the other guest speaker. And here now I can't see Gregory in the meantime. So Gregory, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. You just arrived in time because I was saying that we are hoping to solve the problem. So it's great to have you both on board, and let me thank you again for your time, for your availability. So I will briefly introduce both of you, and then I will explain how the online debate is structured. So I will start from Gregory. Gregory is professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He teaches courses in energy system policy, policy analysis, international environmental policy. He received his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and his AD at Dartmouth College. And he works mainly on technological change from very many different perspectives. And in particular, just to pick up two things that I particularly like is working on negative emissions. I read a recent paper in Environmental Research Letters, and also on PV. Photovoltaic. He has worked a lot on photovoltaic, and actually, as far as I could see, you are writing a book on it also. And by the way, did you finish the book?
No, I still have to work hard on that. Soon.
Okay. Because we are keen in reading it, because it sounds very interesting. And Karsten Neuhoff leads the Climate Policy Department at DAW Berlin. He's professor at the Technical University of Berlin. He has a master in physics from Heidelberg University and PhD in economics from Cambridge. He works extensively, I would say, on low carbon transformation in different sectors, trying to achieve carbon neutrality and suggesting national governments, EU Commission, international organizations, what to do in this direction. It's very active also in the board of climate strategies, and as Gregory, a very active and productive writer of journal articles in top journals in the field. And Karsten has also published two books, Planetary Economics and the Climate Policy After Copenhagen. I don't add anything more because if I describe your CVs in detail, the hours will be gone. So let me instead explain how I plan to structure this online debate. I will structure in two parts, let's say. In the first part, I will propose you a few general questions to, let's say, break the ice and start discussing about today's topic. And then in the second half, we will move to questions from the audience that come online from the audience. So starting with the first part, I wanted to begin with a very general question on your perspective, on your personal experience and opinion concerning how can the European emission trading system spur low carbon innovation. Whether, in your opinion, it has activated more invention or adoption, so innovation or diffusion, and if there are differences, how what the differences are and how can we improve on this side. I will start with Gregory. I would give 3-5 minutes each for this answer.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, and it's good to be here. Yeah. So in terms of the EU ETS and whether it spurs innovation, I would say that in theory it does. It creates a market that would not otherwise be there, and because there's a market, there will be investment. There'll be investment in deploying technologies that exist, and there should be investments in improving technologies that are almost commercially competitive, and there should also be investment in new technologies, and maybe that has to do with invention, really, that will pay off when there's a market for CO2 credits, and the EU ETS creates that credit. So in theory, yes, it should help all aspects of innovation to have a market that otherwise would not be there. But in practice, the evidence has been much more mixed, and I think that has to do with really three issues with the EU ETS. One is the level of the prices. So if prices are low, then they're only going to spur incremental innovations. And what you might expect to see are things that are close to paying off anyway, that just need a nudge in order for them to be in the money. And that might be things like relatively modest or incremental energy efficiency investments. So one issue is the level of prices, and they've been too low. A second is volatility. So the prices have varied quite a bit, say over the past 6 or 7 years. They've gone up and down by, I'd say, a factor of at least 3 or 4. And so because the levels of the prices are hard to predict and they're volatile, it can make payoffs to investment more risky, and this, as a result, have less investment, and particularly investment in innovation, which is inherently risky. And then the third issue with the EU ETS is the longer-term credibility. So some of these investments in new technologies take years to pay off, and maybe 5 to 10 years to pay off, to go from taking something out of the laboratory, improving it, commercializing it, making it a demonstration plant, and then making it actually commercially competitive. That can take quite a bit of time, and the historical evidence is that most important innovations do take time. And so that depends on people having expectations of what a carbon price might look like in 2025 or even 2030. And if those expectations are skeptical about the long-term viability of the program, or about whether there'll be volatility, or whether the levels will be quite low, that will deter investment. So my short answer is that in theory, the EU ETS should provide strong incentives for innovation, but because of the level, the volatility, and issues with the long-term credibility, it hasn't produced as much as we would have hoped.
Okay, thanks, Gregory. I pass on to Karsten with the same question.
Thanks. And I think I also ditched the question. I think it's not one or the other, but effectively it's relevant for both, because innovation and diffusion are, I think, two sides of the same coin, in the way that you don't innovate if you can't diffuse. Gregory pointed this out, and I think it's important to understand that this low carbon transformation is at the core of the sectors that we talk about, and therefore companies will turn every penny they invest and look at in this area, and therefore will always look at both sides together. From this perspective, I think what ETS has been relatively good and successful insofar as to enhance the credibility of the vision that we will move carbon out of these areas, and therefore makes it far more risky to maintain a only focus on the carbon intensive production processes and technologies. So I think companies start to realize, if we want to have a long-term future, we need to be able to also manage low carbon technologies and have access to them and operate them. And I think that was, for me, the biggest success of ETS to date, to actually create this awareness and therefore also the push on engaging on these new options. And for this, the price level has something to say, because a €5 carbon price is just not really that credible. The higher prices now, I think, are really helpful. Volatility doesn't matter that much, because it's about the risk of a high carbon model and not necessarily the stability matters there so much. I think the second element comes to play then is in terms of what is then the business case if you go for a low carbon strategy. If you really dedicate your resources, your staff and your money to a low carbon strategy, do you see a business case that will succeed in the 5 to 10 year horizon, that you have an opportunity to roll this out at a larger scale? And I think that's where in the sectors where we, I think, are now start increasingly dependent on ETS, which is, for example, the basic materials sector, which is 70% of emissions, I think that's where we start to see difficulties on the ETS side in the way that in the post-Paris, in the post-Copenhagen world and the Paris Agreement, we have nationally determined contributions, national policies, and I think that will stay like this, and I think that's okay. That means we have national instruments and therefore also have the sense that carbon pricing won't convert quickly globally, therefore we'll have national carbon leakage protection elements. And I think they need to be better understood in the way that that obviously means that we have free allowance allocation at the moment, and therefore limit the carbon price pass-through, don't have final consumers paying for incremental costs. And if you look at this at a longer vision, you feel, how can I possibly invest in a technology that doesn't cover these incremental costs to the consumers? And that's why with climate strategies, we've been working for the last 3 years to get in more detail on this consumption-based approaches, to say how can we complement the upstream system with a downstream system? How can we effectively add a consumption charge at the same benchmark level to consumers that is provided as free allowance allocation upstream, and thus reinstate the full carbon price signal, get consumers to make this contribution, and therefore make the long-term business case the second side of the coin for low carbon investments today already.
Thank you. Very broad, I would say, answer on your side, Karsten. I didn't expect anything less. That promotes also new perspectives in a way. Let me move on to a second question that I wanted to pose to ask you. I would like to have your opinion about the functioning of the NER 300, the new entrance reserve, the pool of allowances that were set aside for new and expanding installations that are eligible for free allocation. As you know, we have moved to move on, let's say, from NER to Innovation Fund. And so I would like to know your opinion both on the NER functioning performance and on how the Innovation Fund can improve with respect to the NER. And what about large-scale pilot projects and their selection criteria, by the way? Gregory, you go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So the NER 300 is inherently about innovation. It was really about trying to use some of the benefits or some of the revenues from selling emissions credits to promote new technologies. And the focus was on renewables and on carbon capture. And it seemed relatively successful. I think there were 42 projects awarded, and the ones that actually got built tended to be wind and solar projects that did pretty well under the scheme. Bioenergy projects had a mixed record of success under the scheme, and the ones that really were disappointing and unsuccessful were carbon capture and sequestration projects. And there was only one CCS project that was awarded of the 42, and even that one never got built. That was one in the UK. And so there's kind of a question about why the program seemed to work pretty well for small-scale projects like wind and solar, and to some extent bioenergy, and didn't work at all for larger-scale projects like CCS. I think there were a couple of problems with the program design, and I think one had to do with the size of the funding amounts, and a second had to do with the speed of the projects. So in terms of the size, the funding for this program was connected directly to what we talked about before, the EU ETS system. And so depending on the prices of the permits, that affected how much funds were available. And because of the global financial crisis, in part, prices got really low around the time the program started, and that led to a much smaller budget than expected. So one, there wasn't as much money. And so even there was an expectation that the average funding would be on the order of hundreds of millions of euros. In the end, it turned out to be the funding was on the order of tens of millions of euros for each project. So that was one issue. There was another issue that had to do with the distribution of the project. So there's a real emphasis on no country getting more than one or two projects, and so that also tended to limit the scale of the funding. It was meant to be distributed. There were distributed goals included, but it also tended to favor, as a result, smaller projects. The other part of it, so the size was an issue, it was smaller than anticipated, and that didn't favor large-scale projects like CCS. The other issue is that some of the funding was going to be delivered contingent on those projects actually producing electricity in the case of renewables, or actually capturing carbon in the case of CCS. And the timeline associated with building a wind project or a solar project is much shorter than building a large CCS project. So maybe 1 or 2 years for the first part ones, and maybe 5 to 10 for the longer ones. And if you don't get the funding, or at least a substantial part of it, until that plant comes online, that was too risky for most. So that's probably why only one project got selected, and that one never got built. So those are two of the issues, is that the size of the funding was small, and then the speed of actually making the funding contingent was too fast for larger scale projects. So happy to talk more about it, but maybe I'll stop there, and if there's more time later, we can.
Okay, thank you, Gregory. You actually anticipated some questions that I'd like to ask, and maybe we will come back on it later on if time allows. Karsten, your view on this topic?
I think I echo Gregory in many ways, in the way that I thought it was a good idea to dedicate some of the revenues to funding innovation in this space. And I think in this case, it's revenues from auctioning in the power sector, indicating that the consumers, at least in the carbon intensive area, start to contribute, which makes sense. I thought the process around it and the narrative around it was very much, it's a mechanism and we fund some elements. The debate about this construction of the NER 300 was very much about unlocking the CCS strategy at that time, 2007-8. But it was not even then very closely linked to a roadmap how to bring these technologies then closer to the market, to integrate it in a bigger perspective, which looks at all the enabling elements that need to be put together for these technologies. Whether you like it or not is a different question, to function at the end. And so it was almost a fallback option later on to say, to open it for renewables and then to dedicate most of the activities there. I think that's learning experience, I hope, is now reflected. We have a European process with a roadmap 2050 published on 28th of November now, which effectively outlines what is our vision of the developments in different sectors that can then be refined. But then to really think, how can we tailor our innovation funding to help actors to move the technologies along the pathways that we jointly find as a society, and obviously kind of create the competition and the space for innovation amongst the players in there. The second element Greg hinted at already was the scale already was insufficient at that time. And I think that's for me going forward the big challenge right now, that the innovation on Modern Fund is at the scale probably far insufficient to kind of deliver all the innovation that we're looking for across the multiple industrial sectors, and possibly even in the power sector going forward. So I think that's the biggest improvement element, to kind of find additional funding elements to make this more viable through, for example, consumption charges that can add into this pot. And the other dimension, and Greg pointed to, was this question of risk taking. At the end, I think it's a lot of the question of risk allocation, and the NER case, there was a sense we don't want to take too much of the risk at the public side. I think on this innovation space, in the sectors that we look at, there will be a lot of spillover of new ideas to other players. So there's a lot of public benefit, and therefore also the public probably has to take a bigger share of the risks as we are developing our next structures for innovation funding.
Yeah, and risk and spillovers are crucial keywords, obviously, in this context. I would agree with you. So the online debate today is focused on the EU ETS, but I would also like to know your opinion about other non-EU ETS instruments that can be used as lever to activate eco-innovation, innovation in low carbon and investments in low carbon technologies. So what are the other non-EU ETS instruments that you think could be important to be used for the future? Gregory.
Yeah, I might mention a few ideas that have come up, and I'll say that a lot of the the work that these come out of really was supported by Karsten's group when I was working there a couple of years ago. And he had some excellent students and was really supportive of this area of work. So a lot of credit to him with some of these. But some of the ideas we got out of doing that work, and it really comes out to kind of 5 recommendations for policy, and instruments could come out of them. But I think they're a bit more general and high level than that. So one is this idea of making demand pull or making markets robust. Is that part of the reason why NER 300 had problems with big projects was that the market signals weren't there. So even if the funding were there, and it really wasn't, but even if it were, there wasn't a market that was strong enough to value the effort to capture CO2 at a CCS plant. So making markets that there's long-term credibility, where the prices are high enough, and maybe where there's more than one policy that keeps it in place. So that might say member states might have a supportive policy in addition to an EU ETS. So that would be the one important is making sure that the market signals are there. A second one in terms of these projects, one of the faults I think of NER 300 was a little excessive focus on performance. So how much electricity was being produced or how much CO2 was being captured. And really for innovation, what you want to do is prioritize learning. So how much knowledge do you create and how much knowledge emerges from these projects? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the projects are going to capture a lot of CO2 or produce a lot of electricity. The main thing is that they somehow create some knowledge about how things work, or maybe even about how things don't work. But the idea is that they should be experiments that we can learn from and improve from. And so that's the second one. Then the third part is that making the knowledge that comes out of those experiments broadly available so that everybody has access to them and improvements can be shared throughout. And that sometimes can be a problem because if there's private funding for these projects, there's this expectation that the data or the indicators of performance of the technology will be proprietary, that the firms will own them and that'll be their own intellectual property. And if there's public funding involved, really the benefits are when that data and those lessons can be broadly shared. So that's a third issue. A fourth issue is making sure there's private sector engagement, and that might mean funding, but it also means making sure that these projects, that the private sector, that the firms are involved, really have a stake in them, that they're not really just a public funding that the firms are using to keep some people busy or to add a little bit to their business side. To really make sure that there's some reason that they have a stake in the outcome, and whether the outcome is performance in terms of electricity or CO2 or learning. And then the fifth kind of principle we came out of that work was this idea of iterative upscaling. So instead of building a really big project right away, if you look historically, the projects that seem to have worked best, or the technologies that have worked best, is when you take some time to go from small scale to large scale. And I think the best example of that is with Danish wind turbines in the 1980s and 1990s, where they started small and took 20 years to get up to megawatt scale. And the efforts to do that at megawatt scale right away, like in the US and Germany, and I think in Sweden as well, were big failures because they weren't able to assimilate the learning and improvements and iteration you get from many, many repeated. So there may be something to take out of that in terms of getting up to very large scale, like gigawatt scale for CCS. So those were the 5 lessons: making market demand robust, prioritizing learning, disseminating that learning, making sure the private sector is meaningfully engaged, and this idea of upscaling gradually with iteration.
Great, thank you, Gregory. By the way, maybe the audience is interested also in if there is a reference that you can provide to the forum of the guidelines so that they can go more in depth and read it more in depth. Let me go back to my question. Now I pose it to Karsten. It is connected to the guidelines Gregory was talking about, which are certainly useful and help us coming back also on topics like knowledge in general, not only end of the pipe innovations in a way. So Karsten, my question, one I was posing before is, which are, in your view, the non-EU ETS instruments that can be used to spur eco-innovation? If any, obviously.
I think the points that Gregory characterized, I think, are for me some of the most important ones, and certainly the element that innovation implies experimenting, and it requires multiple things in parallel to try it out and perhaps not to go as quickly to the bigger scale as I thought prior to this project we should shift up the gears in terms of pilot projects in the basic material sector. Was for me a big insight from the work he was doing. And the second part around it is that we found in many other sectors that new technologies, new materials, new processes need to be accepted by consumers engaged in our society, and that often requires a lot more institutional changes than what we anticipate at the beginning. And I think that requires then sufficiently political backing to implement all these changes. So that's why I feel the EU 2030 governance, where now countries are delivering their national plans, how I think things are developing until 2030, or national climate plans which implement this, will be quite important, because they can create this quick feedback loops to say, look, we have these new technology options and perhaps even targets to deliver some initial contribution from them, and if there are barriers, to address them directly. Otherwise, there might be great technology, but it gets stuck because the product standard in the building area doesn't allow for the use of this new material, and then we are lost again. I think that is something very difficult, particularly to manage in the case where you have new companies, new players that are not so closely linked to the processes that might be bringing new technologies and new products and new practices to the market in there. Another element, I think, comes back if you talk about this big emissions in the basic material sector, where it is inherently capital intensive to make any one of these pilot projects. And it depends very much on what is your expectation, how robust is the carbon price going forward. And that's where we found that contracts for difference at the project level can be really helpful. So to promise a specific project, if you deliver this project on the site, then for the next 15 or 20 years, every ton of CO2 that you save relative to the benchmark, you will be guaranteed the carbon price of, let's say, 50 or 70 euro for this one. If, as the developer, if the carbon price goes higher, you still get only the 70 euro. So it's a mutual hedge, but it's a hedge which has two big benefits for the technology companies and the investors at the end. First, the carbon price for their project will always be high enough to really run the clean production process. It's nothing more ridiculous than a company that builds up something and then the carbon price is too low to operate an electricity-based process, a CCS-based process. And secondly, the additional revenue that you get from this project is safe and stable, and then you can go even to the bank for this and get lower cost financing. And I think that then allows us to kind of run this innovation agenda with someone less requirement on grant volumes, which obviously is the most scarce resource in our societies in this area. And finally, it gets an even stronger ownership of the companies to make sure that they take forward technologies that they feel comfortable with, that they have confidence can deliver in the future, and therefore makes the biggest challenge I feel in this innovation space more manageable. The challenge, how can public bodies allocate what are put funding, grant funding, to what they think could be potential winners, taking the risk of having losers in there, but how can you make that choice a bit lighter for them?
Thank you, Karsten. We have quite a useful insight and an exhaustive viewpoint. I see while talking with you that there are questions coming from the audience, and so I stop my questions to give space to the audience. And let me see if I manage to. I don't know if there is another question up there, but I see now Pedro Cabral, and by the way, thank you everybody for being online. He's writing, he wrote, I understand that low carbon prices are not enough to push long-term investments. But don't you think that artificial constraints to rise CO2 market price, for instance, backloading and MSR, deteriorates economic efficiency and delivers costly innovation? Gregory.
I guess I would say two things on that. Yeah, I see the point, and yeah, maybe in a first best world that that might be true. I think the issues have to do with the credibility of the long-term price, and if everyone had perfect credibility that they know what the EU ETS price is, or at least that they would be high in 2030 and 2040, a short-term fall in the price would not matter. But that doesn't seem to be the way that people interpret drops in prices. So when prices were low, as they have been, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, the interpretation is that that meant they would be low in the future, in 2020, 2025, 2030. So I think that, and whether that's a perception that's based on reality or not, I guess it depends on the participant to figure out where their perceptions come from. But it does seem that when prices drop, it affects people's longer term expectations. So they don't seem to be independent. So even if it is maybe not economically efficient to have this artificially high price, it does seem like it's an important kind of patch to this imperfect system where people kind of sometimes doubt the long-term viability of it. The other thing is that, in reality, people are sensitive to short-term payoffs, and people's or companies' discount rates may be much higher than a social discount rate, or that the designers of the programs care about. So whereas the social discount rate may be 2 or 3%, companies are working on hurdle rates in their companies of 10 or 15%. And so what matters in the next year or two makes a huge difference, and maybe makes a bigger difference than the public sector or society really thinks about that way. So the near term really does seem to matter more than the longer term for these actors. And so instruments that would increase the short-term prices may actually be helpful, even if I would acknowledge that there is some kind of economic efficiency costs to doing that.
Thank you. I see, I skipped actually a question that I hadn't seen from Jan, who was writing, what are the speakers' views on recycling carbon revenues for energy efficiency? We believe this can significantly increase carbon savings from the ETS. So, Karsten, what's your view on recycling carbon revenues for energy efficiency?
I think the ETS directive already outlines that auction revenues should be used for climate action, both nationally and internationally. And some of this can therefore also easily be investments in energy efficiency in the way that one can overcome inertia, develop new business models, catalyze developments in this area. And I think that's an important part. I think at the national level, and that's where most policies are implemented, it's increasingly important to tell proper stories about how the transformation at a specific sector works. And so, for example, if you have revenues in the industrial sectors, or if you're on the energy efficiency side in the building sector, to say, if I've got the revenue on energy pricing, carbon pricing in this sector, I can push up the prices, the carbon prices, and then I use these revenues to help the sector, the households in this case, for example, to quicker get to a low carbon strategy. I think that's a story that you can share, that people will buy into, and then make sure that some of this will be used to compensate potential distribution impacts that come up. And I think altogether, therefore, a good agenda. And it was interesting that the US was far more successful, I felt, in their national schemes to think of such a system with recycling as a core element of this emissions trading system. I have to admit, in Europe, we didn't have this so strongly in the discourse initially, and I think are moving more to this dimension now.
Great, thanks. Pick up a new question from Stefano Verde from UI. Should EU's new long-term climate strategy be technology neutral? What do you think about it, Gregory?
I would say yes, but. So yeah, I think we need to be open-minded about the technologies that could emerge in the future, and not put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, and assume that the technologies that we have today will be different than the ones we have in 5 years and 10 years. And so being neutral about technology can help us take advantage of, one, new things that come up, and two, the benefits of diversity, of not having all of our energy or all of our carbon removal or all of our climate strategy coming from one particular sector that might look good right now and that turns out to have problems when it's at really large scale. So that's a benefits of diversity and being technology neutral. But I do think in the nearer term, in the shorter term, there really are decisions that need to be made about how funding is provided, how support is provided, and there really is this issue of scale of technologies, that once technologies improve and get larger, and industry gets created around them, and the supply chain gets created, and there's even political support and advocacy groups in favor of them, those technologies can become entrenched, and it become really difficult for new technology to compete with that. And I think that is reality, both in terms of economic perspectives and then political economy perspectives. And so there are reasons for extra support for new technologies that need to get to scale, that need to get demonstrated, that need to get proven reliable, and that need to get de-risked so that they aren't seen as something too new that no one's willing to invest in. And I think policy can play an important role there. Things like NER 400 or other intermediate technology support schemes are necessary, and usually there has to be some decision making about what gets supported and what doesn't. So I think even with that, you can have diversity be a criterion and wanting to support a mix of different technologies, but at some point you do have to make decisions about what will get supported and what won't get supported. So I think technology neutral is important in the longer term, but in the near term we probably need to make decisions about specific technologies in able to support a diverse set of options.
I see your point, thanks. I see a question from Joachim Schleib, by the way, greetings to Joachim, who's asking, will recent adjustments in the EU ETS, such as MSR and the ability to retire certificates, be sufficient to provide the market signals necessary for innovations in the long term? Or will other measures like a floor price be needed, and how likely will they be implemented? By the way, I see another question that is connected to that. What are the views of the speakers on carbon price floor, on EU level, on second best as regional setup in the power sector? So they seem to be connected. I picked them together and I pose them to Karsten.
I think for the shift away from conventional technologies, the floor price of the level that we are discussing, 20 euros or so, does not help sufficiently, because it still allows, as we've seen on the coal side in the German discussion right now, to continue business as usual. And I think the political leverage to kind of get this higher was always a bit difficult to achieve, particularly because you then have different fuel prices, coal, gas, and others that might change over time. So I felt also for the conventional assets, usually the volatility and the risk of high prices, there's a link to a scarcity pricing element in there is almost more relevant than a floor price. If you go to the new investments, for them, again, I think most low carbon choices in the industry sector have something expectations of, let's say, 50 euro per ton of CO2 that you need to run the projects that are coming up in the next years, often initially together with some grants. And again, that is an element where I think it's difficult to achieve with a floor price, but where you can back this with project-based carbon contracts to deliver the specific projects that are signed, then the regulatory risk is taken away. So that's why I feel if I look at the sectors, look at the specific projects, some guarantees are important, but I feel it's far more suitable to tailor that to the projects rather than to put a lot of effort into a European carbon floor price where it's nice to avoid the political embarrassment of a 5 euro carbon price, but from the practical side, I don't see as many benefits it would take forward then.
Right. Roberta D'Alessandro writes, might be more efficient to remunerate innovative projects based on their real effect on the social welfare, assessing the avoided emissions, energy savings, and so on, instead to have a risky and unpredictable ETS scheme. Quite a provocative question that I turn to Gregory.
Yeah, that is a good provocative question. I mean, and I guess when you have a new project, it's got multiple benefits, and it might have benefits in terms of local air quality, or it might have benefits in terms of local employment, or reduce imports of energy, so it creates some energy security benefits, and those benefits are not priced into emissions trading prices. So maybe there are other benefits outside of the climate benefits that need to be included. So I guess there is something to that. Although in terms of the avoided emissions, the EU ETS prices should be rewarding that, and they should be rewarding the lowest cost way to remove emissions. So in theory, that's it. But I guess maybe it comes back to this issue, and he calls it a risky and unpredictable ETS scheme. And I think maybe that is the issue, is that maybe you need other supportive policies if you think the prices won't be high enough to really reflect the damages that are coming from CO2 emissions. And then the final response I'd have is that another benefit of some of these innovative projects is the social learning that takes place. So what you learn about a new technology when you deploy it in the real world, what happens when you build the first 1 or 2 or 5 plants and see how they work, see how they operate in an actual grid system or with a pipeline of CO2, or how the storage works over time. And those all have social benefits. And so I would say that those benefits also extend beyond what's captured in the EU ETS price. And so I think that is a reason why we're talking about complementary policies like the new entrants reserve, or other policies that would support kind of innovative projects.
Great, thanks. A question that I see to Karsten from Isabella Aloisio from UI. In recent years, there is a trend of de-subsidization in European renewable energy policy design, shifting from covering incremental costs towards facilitating risk hedging. Can you tell us more about the German experience on this, considering that it was the country that installed the most PV and had the leading PV firms? So a German case and your experience about this specific topic.
Indeed, I think that is the fascinating development that we've seen over the last few years, that with declining technology costs and over the last year increasing costs of conventional power generation, in principle you think some of the renewable technologies are in the money, and some people started to argue, okay, we don't need any public schemes around this anymore. Together with Niels May and others, we looked into this in detail and found out, what does it mean if you make an investment into a wind or a PV project in this case, without any remuneration mechanism. That means someone has to take the risk about what is the future power price, how it's evolving, which is linked to a lot of public policy choices coming along with this. And ultimately going through the calculations of the financing of the project, through the assessment, who buys the power, what kind of risk and cost of risk is in there, we found that if we have no risk hedging instruments in this market, then every megawatt hour of wind power or solar power will be 30% more expensive than in the presence of such risk hedging instruments. And in addition, it would be rather difficult to mobilize the scale of investment to deliver, for example, our 65% renewable target by 2030. So I think that's where, on the power side, we have policy objectives which are quite clearly defined now, what share of renewables, even broken down to specific technologies, because we know how they interact. We need wind in the winter time, and sun fits quite well with this, that we then can structure policy instruments that facilitate some of the risk hedging around this. And do this in the context of a carbon price, which makes sure that these risk hedging instruments are in principle in the money, therefore can also be evaluated, restructured according to this objective, but take away policy risk and some of the market risks that are, for market failures, difficult to risk in the market, to hedge in the market away. And I think that is the area why I feel the IPCC report showing how urgent it is to get to carbon neutrality, and therefore also providing quite a clear benchmark for what are the technologies that we need or that are actually in our technology mix in the midterm if we want to be carbon neutral. I think that provides more clarity in terms of structuring a shared public process to say, where do we want to go, what are the technologies that are in there, and how do we hedge investors against the policy risk that they still face in this transition process until we have fully phased out all conventional technologies globally which hopefully happens sometime as well.
Okay, thanks. There is a new question, quite interesting one from Donald. Donald Friken writes, in terms of the order of different ETS reforms, price floors, technology choices, phase out of the free allocation, other policies, and so on, what would be the right sequence and what would be the wrong sequence for reforms? Gregory.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm completely qualified to answer it. But I guess the two things I would say is, one is that I like the question in that there is this idea of policy sequencing, is that you can make your overall policy goal more feasible and more achievable if you choose a sequence that creates political support in the early stages to make the harder choices and maybe the more painful decisions to have more momentum behind them and political support, even if they're socially beneficial, that can help to have the sequence right. So there's kind of a economic efficiency aspect, but there's also a political economy aspect. And I think you would want to take both of those into account. And then I guess for me, in terms of what the objective of getting the sequence right would be, I think really for me it comes down to this long-term credibility of the whole overall system, of carbon pricing in general, and of higher and rising carbon prices in the longer term future, and the incentives that come from that, which is to phase out things like coal and to start to develop and invest in and improve innovative low carbon technologies. So I would go for the sequence that creates the strongest expectations in the longer term, that pricing will be there, that companies will be held accountable for paying those prices, and that they'll be high enough and rising to catalyze investment.
So we have a sequence which is it's not easy to plan in advance. Thank you, Donald, for this very interesting question. Actually, Donald asked also a question directly to Karsten, saying in the Netherlands we see the problem that without risk hedging instruments, the necessary flexible demand for renewables also doesn't develop itself. Do you have an idea on this? Planning more research? And I would add to Donald's question, what are the new research lines that you have in mind more broadly? Karsten.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add quickly to Gregory's point that in a way, not to frighten people that are working on ETS, for example, on the policy side. I don't think we have a few regulatory adjustments that are in the process right now on the benchmarking, updating, and elements like this. I think the major step that I would see for the next, either this period of the Talanoa dialogue or in 5 years, so the review processes that are linked in ETS to the international developments are the ones where we have envisaged in ETS to check whether it's sufficiently effective to achieve our targets. And the only point that from our analysis would be needed on the ETS side is the inclusion of the consumption part for some of the basic commodities. The other elements I feel are very well put in place right now, and I think there's little change that will affect other parts of the ETS from these approaches. I think that makes it a small manageable element, and many of the things that Gregory pointed out on the innovation funding side are specific instruments that can be adjusted over time. Innovation funding inherently having to be more flexible, and I think that's kind of the idea of breaking down the big long-term climate target into pathways for the sectors, where then you need to give policymakers a set of instruments that they can adjust over time to follow the pathway that we agree to on the political side in the decarbonization agenda. And I think that is somehow making it easier to think about how they fit together again, and following Gregory's point, to prioritize then at certain times, what do we want to do now? In terms of the flexibility, if I understand the question correct, in the power system, I was also intrigued. We just did a Horizon 2020 project on flexibility on the heating demand side. And we're running our models and didn't really find until 2030 much value added in flexibilizing heat storages in the building part. Until we updated the model to kind of capture the new political objective, 65% renewables in Germany. And suddenly the entire picture changed. So it's really something where with higher shares of renewable, the value of flexibility in the system is going to be far bigger, both to capture surplus flexibility and to kind of feed into the system at times when there is perhaps insufficient capacity on the renewables side linked to wind or solar situations. And at the same time, we don't want to wait to develop these business models, develop the practices, develop the institutional setting to realize these flexibility options until in 2030 suddenly we think there's a big case, because then it takes probably too long to build this up. And so I think that's somehow an element where we need to catalyze flexibility elements early on to build the capacity, the understanding, whatever it takes to realize these flexibility parts. And the second part is asking about research projects. One of our objectives right now is to better understand how we can structure in the power market the contracts such that market participants contract also for the flexibility elements in 1 or 2 years ahead of time. Because typically a flexibility element that helps to compensate for a lack of rainfall or too much wind will have to cope with the uncertainty of the weather pattern in a year, but for next year you don't know what the weather pattern is. And so once you have contracted for 1 or 2 or 3 years ahead of time, you have a far more stable revenue stream, and that is certainly part of the revenue flexibility hedging you need in order for these new business models to work.
I take advantage of the question on research, new research line, to ask also Gregory, what are in his view the new most promising research lines on eco-innovation and low carbon technologies, investments in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is to do research or to figure out somehow appropriate metrics for supporting innovative technologies. And I think, that's been it's been a bit back and forth in the past about how we decide on which projects to support and how we evaluate projects that we are supporting and whether we decide to continue funding. It's on one hand, we've done support where you just fund it directly. It seems like a good idea. It's got some technology promise. It's got some potential to reduce CO2 or produce electricity, and you use public funds and support that technology. So that would be kind of the most, technology push sort of orientation. On the other hand, and this is maybe more the style of NER 300, is you could make support contingent on being productive. So make support contingent on actually capturing CO2 or producing electricity or negative emissions removing CO2. So you could have criterion and metrics that have to do with performance. And you can see why you'd have stronger incentives and kind of more accountability by having these metrics where you're actually rewarding performance. But I think there is an issue with doing that, in that you may be discouraging risk-taking. And for a lot of novel technologies, we don't know which technologies are going to work out. And in a way, those are the most important projects to fund, the ones where there's most uncertainty about whether they'll be effective, they'll be flexible enough, whether they'll be efficient enough. And for a lot of them, you actually have to build them, and building takes some investment and support. And so I think there's some middle ground between actually determining projects based on absolute performance and then funding them just because they seem like good ideas. And so I think a really important research area is to develop appropriate metrics, ways that you could assess whether technology would be a good project to fund, and then how to assess that in the interim as it's actually being built or is actually operating. And for me, the most important assessment is learning. How much knowledge do you create? How much do you gain? And how much can you share? And so that's the trick, I think, is how do you actually measure learning, if that's really what you want to promote on innovative new technologies.
So this goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, Gregory, and broadens the view to the importance of learning in general, in a way, and the spillover effects in general. I think we are approaching the end. I think I will pick up a last question from Simone, who's asking about carbon leakage. I see he is on compensation of a direct cost. He says there is no harmonized way for that, but do you think that this should be dealt with at the EU level and include compensation for sectors or subsectors that are in increased risk of carbon leakage? 1 minute to Karsten, 1 minute to Gregory on this question. Karsten first.
I think that's a lot to do with politics in terms of I think one cannot only look at it from the sector's perspective, because then obviously you would come to the clear conclusion, why not to do the same thing for indirect costs as you do for direct costs? But I think it raises this, at the same time at the European level, there was a sense if we kind of suddenly shift all the funding from national compensation mechanisms to European compensation mechanisms, then we suddenly have a different debate going on there as well on reallocation of resources across Europe. So I think that's why we have the situation that we have right now at the moment. I think we have to move one step further. We had envisaged our compensation mechanisms, our free allocation mechanisms as transitionary carbon leakage protection mechanisms in a world that was envisaged to converge to a global carbon price. Now, with the Paris Agreement, we have the focus not on developing a global carbon price that's common, but on supporting countries in implementing their nationally determined contributions. And I think if that is the basis, the focal point of the Paris Agreement, then I think we have to implement our policies, including the carbon pricing and ETS policies, such that this is achievable. And I think that means linking it back more closely to the consumers in our countries as well. And once we have this link back to the consumption charges in there, I think then in this context, you can easily revisit then also how do you do the compensation for direct and indirect costs. If consumers have to pay for direct and indirect costs linked to carbon intensive production of the materials, then on the upstream side, you can easily also make the compensation happen. And I think it is addressing the environmental concerns. It addresses the fiscal issues. And if you demonstrate how the funds are used to make the transformation happen, energy efficiency was mentioned earlier on, I think then you get also the public acceptance for such a development of our approach.
Thank you, Karsten. The last word on this to Gregory as well.
Well, my last word is I defer to Karsten's expertise on that question. He's really, you can see he's thought a lot about that issue. So I think that's the best way to put it.
Great. I would like to pick up many other questions or ask these questions myself, but I'm afraid we have to stop here for today. So I would like to thank, first of all, both speakers. You have been very kind in participating, being available, and Gregory at a different timing from the US. I hope it was not too early. And seriously, thanks everybody for participating. And I'd like to thank also my team, the FSR climate team, who's supporting me behind the scenes, and the FSR online team, who's organizing the online debates. So please stay tuned. We'll have other events coming, and I hope to see you soon, either in person or online.